Mathematic webinar. We have our partners with us today, Sunrise Labs. Thank you so much for joining us. We have great content for you today. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity in 2024 and beyond. There's a lot to cover. We have an hour for today's discussion, and we are going to be saving some time for Q&A. So please make sure to put that in the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen at any time questions arise to you. Before I turn it over to our panel, just want to introduce myself quickly. I'm Nicole Owens from MassMedic. If you're not familiar with our organization, we are a medical device trade association for companies primarily in the New England area. And we work to bolster the ecosystem through education and connection, events like this, advocacy and awareness. All right, as I mentioned, we have an awesome panel for you today. Our moderator is Dave Hibbard. He's the Vice President of Engineering for Sunrise Labs. And he's joined by an all-star panel, including Shiv Sebastian. He is the CTO of Citrellis Biosystems, and then his team as well from Sunrise Labs, Christine Nason, Director of Software, and Nick Daniel, Senior Principal Software Engineer. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave for the conversation and enjoy. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to MassMedic for hosting us today. It's certainly an honor to be here and be able to talk about cybersecurity and, just tell people what we know. So again, my name is Dave Hibbard. My role at Sunrise Labs is the VP of Engineering. I'll just give a brief overview of my background, and then I'll let the rest of the team give their background as well. But for me, I've been working in the medical device industry my whole career, so about 30 years now, a little bit more than that. I've worked both on the industry side and the services side. So I've worked with large manufacturers such as Medtronic, and then services companies such as Sunworks. And then as far as different types of technologies and products that I've worked on, so I've spent quite a bit of time in image-guided surgery and radiation oncology and kind of combining those two aspects together for positioning and for radiation delivery. I've spent a fair amount of time working on peritoneal dialysis, and then a fair amount of time also on insulin delivery, looking at different types of pumps and companion apps to go along with those pumps. So I'd like each one of the panel to introduce themselves as well. So Shiv, maybe you can go next.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks, Nicole and MassMedic for hosting us today. My name is Shiv Sebastian. I'm the CTO of Citrellis. It's a startup, Boston-based startup. It's a Harvard MGH spinoff. What we do is remove skin in a scarless fashion. And believe it or not, it requires a lot of data-driven decision-making, and therefore there is a role for cybersecurity even in our application. As far as I'm concerned, before this startup, I've been in the medical device industry for 20 plus years. I had my own startups. I sold one, I tanked one, and then I had large company experiences with Medtronic, LivaNova, Philips. And then I took a detour to Google, and at Google I was part of their machine learning team. And at that time, we also started working very closely with the FDA on their cybersecurity guidance. So I've been kind of watching this journey of how cybersecurity has evolved over these years, and very excited to be here.
Thank you. Christine, you want to go next?
Happy to. So I'm Christine Nason, Director of Software at Sunrise Labs. I've been developing medical devices for over 20 years at various layers of the software stack, but primarily in the embedded space. The types of devices I've worked on range to class 2, class 3 medical devices with battery operated technologies, wireless and fluid moving devices. So in my current role, I work with this software group to develop solutions for our clients, and among them, cybersecure medical devices, which we're going to get more into today.
Thank you, Christine. All right, Nick.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. So my name is Nicholas Daniel. I've been working primarily on medical devices, but not just only in the medical space for about the last 15 years. My experience as it pertains to cybersecurity, I originally started working on devices early in my career that were some of the first generation medical devices to integrate network connectivity. And that came with a whole host of challenges of understanding the cybersecurity space so that I could develop robust solutions to mitigate these risks. which took me kind of all over of discovering this, since this is primarily before any FDA guidance. So hoping today I can share some of my experience and how that pertains to, as in my current role where I'm architecting and designing secure and robust solutions for medical devices.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here today. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Just to give a little bit of background information why we thought this was important. So cybersecurity, every day gains more visibility. You see ransomware attacks and other attacks. You see just medical devices having issues, problems, again, being attacked in various different ways. And so the more scrutiny and really the whole cybersecurity field gets more and more complex with each passing day. So the FDA originally drafted some guidance. I think it's been almost about 8 years now, but that was sent out as a draft. There's lots of feedback and a couple of revisions that went there as well. And then finally it was brought into law in the CFR 8.8020 about 15 months ago, something like that. But the final draft didn't really come out until the middle of last year. So the final draft, final release guidance document really has been out for a few months now, maybe 6 months or so. And interestingly, even yesterday, as we were kind of preparing for this webinar, we saw that another draft guidance came out, and it's really just a supplement to the document that was released 6 months or so ago. But the one thing that I found interesting in it, just giving it a quick read, is there were some items where it said the FDA recommends blank, or the FDA recommends you submit this document, and now there's some of those recommends were changed to musts. So again, it's becoming more and more visible and more crucial, I think, to the FDA submission and product development overall. So with that said, I'd like to kind of start out and maybe kind of start on, how does one get started in cybersecurity, and how does what's the best place to start, and really about timing. So Christine, maybe you can talk about a little bit about where to start the cybersecurity in the product development lifecycle, and what's important and when.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, one of the key takeaways that I got from the guidance is that the cybersecurity should really be integrated into the total product lifecycle. So when you ask about when we should start, as early as possible, ideally even during product conceptualization. So I think as medical device manufacturers, developers, we're used to incorporating safety risk management into the whole development process. And so security risk management really is a form of risk management. And so TIR 57 has this great diagram where it shows security risk management paralleled with safety risk management and how they can affect each other. And so just early in the process, we want to be incorporating cybersecurity. So one of the first things you want to consider is your device security risk profile. Now that can vary depending on the device. For example, if you have a device that's, let's say, in a secure area at a hospital, it's not network connected, it's only going to be really accessed by doctors and nurses, that's going to have a very different security risk profile than something that's a device that's in a patient home where you don't have control over the house network, or in a publicly accessed area. So those are things to consider, the types of security requirements you want to think about early in the process. So, some of these examples of security requirements could be like, do you need authentication? Is there patient data, private patient data that we need to keep confidential? Do we want to use encryption in our communication protocols? So it's always great to incorporate cybersecurity early on. It creates a more cohesive solution and architecture. And so one of the ways that we can do this is to incorporate cybersecurity into your quality management system, so QMS. I think the FDA refers to the term secure product development framework, but it's really a set of processes that incorporates security management into your whole product lifecycle. And that's going to look different for every organization. with the goal of, you want to reduce vulnerabilities and make safer devices. And so if you incorporate, let's just say you incorporate cybersecurity after the fact, there's a lot of downsides to that. So first of all, you don't have a cohesive solution. Your security measures are more like patches or bolt-ons. It's not going to be as efficient. In addition, let's say, for example, you discover you need secure boot. You do your analysis too late. Well, with secure boot, typically you need encryption keys in your hardware. So that could make you have to redesign your hardware. I mean, there's a lot of detriments to that, right? You've got your schedule, your budgets, and it's just something you want to incorporate early on. So to bring it back to your question, you want to incorporate security as early as possible.
Okay, thank you. So Shiv, one of the things that Christine mentioned was the environment. So maybe you want to talk about some of the sort of environmental and maybe physical security concerns and how that could affect your overall architecture as you're starting to develop a product.
Yeah, sure. So I think, as Christine mentioned, I think there's a whole bunch of considerations from an architecture point of view. I think as far as, physical and environmental are concerned, I think, it again comes down to fundamentally, the issues around, access control, where you actually want to, of course, everything depends on the type of your product, right? I think, but at the end of the day, you want to, this is more of an issue when you have, essentially data coming out of your device, and you essentially have other third parties and other locations where you're actually storing your system, where I think it kind of gets into a much more interesting conversation. As far as, the actual device is concerned, you just have to make sure that, there's not, if somebody really wants to do something physically to your device, there's not much you can do to stop it. But I think you still want to make sure that you have the right kind of access control capabilities from a perspective. If you have a software interface to have kind of multi-factor authentication, some kind of authentication system. If you have a physical needs, then you have to have something like, like key cards and biometric access, be able to have some sort of surveillance capabilities, some sort of visitor management in case of data centers and data that's kind of stored there. When it comes to environmental, controls, you have to, in general, when you think about architecture, you have to think about, disaster recovery as a global principle. And I think whether it's related to power backups or whether it's related to climate control or any kind of fire-related issues, fundamentally, it all translates back to how do you actually build resilience and redundancy in your system. So fundamentally, that's kind of what you're trying to do with these environment controls. So, that's typically what you have to think about when you're thinking about environmental controls is, how do you set up for disaster recovery? How do you actually plan for backup and storage? So those are the things that you have to kind of keep in mind when it comes to, I would say, architectural elements as it pertains to physical and environmental safeguards.
Thank you. All right, so Nick, kind of expanding on the architecture a little bit. So if you're starting to develop a system architecture and then break that down into a software architecture, what are some of the sort of the key considerations that you're looking at there? And, even in terms of operating systems and just the architecture as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to echo a couple points already made, which is understanding the use cases is a really big one. Understanding the environments so that you can adequately build appropriate controls. Understanding the use cases and the data flow and the purposes for all the data will let you better categorize your assets. Doing so will let you better analyze your different attack surfaces and threat vectors. Because the goal is the architectural phase is to design out security risks. If we can design them out, then we don't have to come up with unique or novel solutions for mitigations. This is why it's so powerful doing this security analysis early, is that you can avoid problems holistically, which is a great empower of the architecture, which those solutions often can't be bolted on later, those ones that really design out the problems. But beyond that, sometimes based on the use cases of the device, you might not be able to design out those problems. That is where you start looking into these security mitigations, looking at the different assets you're protecting, such as data, whether the data at rest, motion, and in use, and making sure you're taking all the appropriate steps to control that. That might be choosing authentication techniques that meets with your use cases, encrypting the data at storage, and hardening your software systems to prevent against these type of attacks.
Great, thank you. So one of the other things that Christine mentioned was one of the FDA's concepts of the secure framework. Do you have any thoughts on how that's set up, and what are some considerations in terms of that framework?
Yeah, so for as far as like the security risk management frameworks, there's a few out there. I have my own preferences. The ones I typically stand to is TIR 57. That was one that Christine had brought up. I really like the way they describe the risk management, especially as somebody who's very familiar with 14971, which is generic medical device management. It really puts it in the context of the risk management that we're very familiar with, but steps into the space of secure cybersecurity, where the probability of initiation is a little different and has to have different considerations. So TIR 57, I think, is really good. When it comes to actually conducting your risk assessment, the one I draw on is the NIST 830. I think it's a nice starting point for diving into all of the uniqueness that cybersecurity has as it comes to risk assessment. So those are the ones that I typically draw on to conduct the secure process, as well as conducting my risk assessments. Though I will give honorable mentions to the ISO 27K documents, as well as COBIT and NIST 853. There's lots of frameworks out there. I think that really, to make your own process, you really should read them all and understand the pros and cons that they all weigh. And you can really make a very robust process. And these documents explain not only how, but why. So these are very good documents.
Okay, fantastic. I think one of the things that we've kind of been hinting at here is jumping into one of the early phases, which is threat analysis. So, Christine, maybe you can kind of give a little bit of overview of how we connect a threat analysis, and maybe how we've incorporated like the NIST standard into that threat analysis and do some of the scoring.
Sure. So as for at Sunrise, for risk assessments for security, we use the NIST 800-30 that Nick mentioned. So that's a guide for conducting risk assessments as it pertains to security. So this is a guide that's widely used in many industries, and one that's actually recommended by the FDA. So this guide, it provides a structured, methodical approach to identify threats, evaluate the risks, and then determine what kind of control measures we can put in place to reduce risk. I see it a lot. It's very analogous to the FMEA process, where the FMEA is based on probability and severity of harms, and that determines your risk. And so for security risk, it's really the exploitability with the severity of impacts. Now, those impacts could be safety harms or business or reputation harms too. And so one of the inputs, or the input into the risk assessment, is understanding what are your attack surfaces. And a good way to figure out what that is to develop a threat model. So a threat model is typically a diagram that shows a system view of how that product, what that looks like in its like ecosystem of use. So it's going to describe, what are your external interfaces, showing internal interfaces, where the assets or keys are located in your system. And part of that is defining where your trust boundary is. And that's going to depend on the risk profile of the device. But really, what this threat model shows is your attack surfaces. What are the entry points into the system? And so that's the first step of your risk assessment. So once you have your attack surface, and I can just do a overview of the kind of the different steps, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. So once you have your attack surface, the next thing is, what are your threat sources? And so that's identifying who are your adversaries. Are they outsiders with moderate secure knowledge? Maybe they have like Wireshark, or do you have to worry about insiders? I mean, it depends on the risk profile of the device. Again, it's going to vary. Then you're going to identify threat events. So examples of this could be like denial of service from jamming, or sniffing data to read critical data, man-in-the-middle attacks, things like that. And then another factor are identifying predisposing conditions. Let's say you have to interface to a legacy system or another device, and they only provide a certain interface to communicate, and that communication is unencrypted. Well, there's nothing you can do about that. It's part of the system, but it should be factored into risk. So once you have that information, the next thing is determining the likelihood of these threat events occurring. And that's a difficult one that one requires definitely someone with a lot of experience in this area, and it can actually change over time depending on new exploits and discovered. So with all that information, what comes out of that is risk, right? You've got the exploitability, the impacts, and your risk. And so at this point, are the risks acceptable or unacceptable? If they're unacceptable, you've got to put in your security control measures, mitigations. And some examples of that could be adding encryption, or doing integrity checks on critical data, or adding passwords to a BIOS or the screen. Actually, one of the attack surface you may not think of is a touchscreen. I've worked on products where the service interface is available, and if you can just go in there and change critical parameters, that's definitely a huge concern. And so what comes out of that do you have a password as a mitigation? And ideally, the password is unique to each device. So at the end of it, you have your residual risk after your mitigations, and hopefully at that point, they're all acceptable. So that's just kind of an overview of the process that we use here at Sunrise.
Thank you. So Nick, one of the concepts that Christine mentioned was the trust boundary. How do you define a trust boundary and identify that?
Yeah, trust boundaries are a little tricky. They're basically setting up a line where you as a product have considered everything within this boundary as trusted. So this, as an example, if you have a little box and you have external interfaces, maybe you draw those trust boundaries just around the internals of your box, to the point where we're not going to worry about the security between one particular integrated circuit talking to another integrated circuit, so we don't have to encrypt internal communication. That might be a place where you draw the trust boundary, though your environment and use cases could vary. The box alone might not be the trust boundary, or it could extend past the box. So if you have two systems that are communicating closely, maybe your trust boundary includes both of those systems. So it's mostly establishing a line where at this point, anybody who crosses this line is considered trusted. Otherwise, you will end up in this infinite loop of finding your way all the way down to the circuitry of trying to protect those. And you have basically diminishing returns after a certain amount.
Thank you. So when you're creating a threat model and trying to identify all the attack vectors, what are some of the difficulties that you've seen? And, are there advice that you have to try and make that a little bit easier and gain consensus between all the members? Because that's in any risk management, that's always the hardest part.
I think that's I mean, I think the challenge of just building a threat model, of course. I mean, I think you've said it multiple times, everything's use case dependent, but I think there are a few, I would say there are three, and over these years and across many different products, I think there's fundamentally, I would say, three really critical things that cause difficulty in creating a robust threat model. The first one is just the evolving cybersecurity threat landscape. You cannot prevent what you can't predict, and which means that your threat model is dynamic in nature. So today you debate about what you have your product today and what it can do, but you don't know what is out there in the wild when this product goes out. So the debate is around how much can we predict today about what we're going to expect tomorrow, and that's never easy. Unless you live in Arizona and you can predict every other day is a sunny day. I mean, that's not the case in cybersecurity. So there's that issue. The second issue, which I always find is a point of debate and also a point of, I think I would say, difficulty, is as medical device manufacturers, as companies go, we always make the decision of what do we build and what do we, let's say, buy, so to speak. And from that vantage point, I think the issue is around, the complexity in your device and the ability to do interoperability. So every time so complexity I define in terms of the different components inside your medical device system. And every time you have an interface, as Christine mentioned, every time you have an interface, now whether it's an internal interface, whether you're, let's say, whether you're actually incorporating a software of unknown provenance inside your product, all of these things then create these vulnerability points. They create these attack surfaces that you don't have full control on, and you have to rely on your partners to provide the information or have the same level of commitment towards security. So there's that issue of complexity, which is, I think, more about how the system is built. And then the other aspect of this is the interoperability with other external systems. So if you're thinking about it in a healthcare provider setting where you actually have to deal with hospital IT. Now, yes, we can ensure that a product is essentially secure, but then it still has to interface with an EHR and EMR system that the hospital IT controls. So then having that interoperability again creates that vulnerability point that I think becomes, again, a topic of discussion of how do we actually create a threat model where we have a product that's, let's say, has soup components inside the system, has interoperability with external infrastructures. So that's, I would say, the second difficulty in actually creating threat model. And I would say the third one, which I think is equally important, is I would say the diverse usage environments. We talked about how different usage environments impact threat models, and that's kind of I would say, the third critical component, because again, as medical devices go, you can use them in your home, and if you're using it in your home, then you're connecting to an insecure network. Then I think that again creates a vulnerability similar to your requirements for the same thing connecting to a hospital IT network is different. So different usage environments again create different kind of threat models. But I would say that I think those three are, I would say, the top three issues that I've seen that people have debated. And I think, is there a right answer or a wrong answer? No, it's just very specific to the product, depending on which product you're actually trying to build and how much is your risk appetite and what is the true harm that you've identified. I think defines the path forward. But I would say that those would be, in my mind, probably the three main, I would say, difficulties that I'm kind of trying to summarize across all the products that I've built so far.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, looking at other systems that may be involved and connected to yours, because that really does make a much more complex system than when you're just putting a product out by yourself. So if you're trying to talk to hospital information system, it really does complicate the issue. One of the questions that came up while we were talking, I'll throw this one out to Nick, but anyone can answer if they want to, which is, what is mandated by the FDA? So the particular question was around, are there standards that are mandated? But we can mention some of the standards that are available to help guide you. But is anything required, and what is required just from a general sort of submission into the FDA?
Yeah. So The FDA doesn't call out a mandation to follow any particular standard, but they are looking for you to follow a process. So the standards that I listed, like TIR 57 or ISO 27001, these are standards that kind of outline a typical process that you could follow. But I think as far as what the FDA is looking for is for you to document and describe your process to make sure you're meeting the intent of the guidance, but your process is kind of up to your own. I think pulling these sources from all this information and making a complete story for your process to cover all your concerns is the most important part.
Yeah, I think, and I'll just add to that is I think something that we're working, very closely with Sunrise as an example is, I think, so our quality management system essentially, I mean, like any other quality management system, has the phase for, requirements definition, risk management right up front. But most of the risk management, as Christine was alluding to, is focused on, let's say, safety risk assessment. But I think having a very specific SOP that's targeting cybersecurity risk assessment, specific requirements around cybersecurity, creating those kind of standard operating policies, and then following those policies through design, through test, through documentation, then kind of is what I think Nick alluding to by saying process. So that's kind of the process that at least we at Cytrellis follow. This is kind of how is what companies that are dealing with data, that are dealing with cybersecurity issues are doing, is to incorporate SOPs, because at the end of the day, engineers follow design control processes. If you want to create that attitude and that mindset of security by design, that has to be part of a policy.
Okay, and the other question that came in was kind of a long question, so I'll paraphrase it a little bit. But this question is asking about non-medical software. So maybe it's like MDDS or something like that that's interacting with a medical device, and would you have different considerations there? So I think the first thing that I would say is whoever developed the medical device software is certainly responsible for the cybersecurity of that device. But I don't know, Christine, if you have a few thoughts on if you were developing something to interact with a medical device, again, maybe it's like MDDS or something like that. Would you follow the same process? And what would you see as maybe some major differences, or even maybe there's only minor differences?
That's a good question.
One of the things that I think would be a little bit different maybe would be the way you're doing the risk assessment, right? So if it's not a medical device, maybe you're not as concerned about patient safety, right? And by definition, it shouldn't be, right? But I think the process may be similar.
Yeah, I think I would say the process has to be similar, even if you're interfacing with a medical device, and you're providing, let's say, a software backend, for example. That's what the medical device data systems are. That's why they're class 1, typically, MDDS. And the thing, though, is that I think at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier about interoperability, I think the accountability factor for cybersecurity, when you are actually relying on partners to work with, has to be mutually agreed upon. So I think, you have to make sure that the data that's coming into your MDDS system is somewhat encrypted, right? Because I think, because the data is getting shipped from a medical device to your MDDS system. So at least you have to ensure when the data is coming in, what kind of controls can you establish for integrity checks, as an example. So these are things that I think you will have to kind of ensure happens when the data comes in. So I do not necessarily think that it's a different approach to security assessment and security management, security planning, and security incorporation. But I think it's just it becomes a shared responsibility model, where you are actually sharing the responsibility of cybersecurity with the devices that you're interfacing with. And so an example here would be, like it's the similar example that I can give when let's say if I build a SaaS platform and I'm developing it on Azure, I'm developing it on AWS. Typically, you have a business, agreement addendums with these kind of companies, right? And these addendums are essentially the idea of, hey, I'm using your infrastructure to build my application. So we have a shared responsibility for security. And so that's kind of the idea that kind of goes along with, any MDDS system. Even though it's not medical software, but it's still a software that is supporting a medical application.
All right, thank you. Maybe one last question before we kind of move into the V&V, but as we kind of wrap up, talking about sort of developing the product in the development phase that you would go through normally, maybe you can talk a little bit about how often you'd sort of go back and revisit your threat model, revisit any like known vulnerabilities, that type of thing as you go through the development process.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the things for me that triggers me to revisit my risk assessment is kind of two different factors. One is presumed use cases and features. Any changes to the product landscape or definition really should cause you to reevaluate your risks. You could have really changed your risk landscape by modifying the use case or the features of the product. So that would be stuff if I was making a new alpha, a beta, or a version 2, we would re-review and go back through the process. The other thing that really informs that is, and there's one of the recommendations of the FDA is to integrate um, your monitoring of your software of unknown provenance or SOUP during your development life cycle. And some of the benefits of that is when you start seeing new CVEs or common vulnerability enumerations, which are basically just reports of different vulnerabilities that exist in different software systems, that if you are ingressing those and analyzing those the development phase, they're better adequately describing the landscape of your software. So if you see that, you might see that that is a higher risk than you originally assumed and has different types of impacts. So continuously monitoring for different vulnerabilities or different hazards that might exist, those can continuously feed back into your risk assessment. So ideally, this is a continuous process that you're evolving as you get new information as you go.
All right. Christine or Shiv, any last minute comments on the development phase before we kind of hop over to some of the more vulnerability analysis and SOUP and things like that?
No, I think we covered this phase well.
All right.
You can move to the next section.
All right. So if we now jump into V&V, right? So you have your product process develops, you go through the implementation phase, and now you're kind of getting into how you're going to test this. So, there's a bunch of things that are going to be required as part of your submission, including an SBOM and vulnerability analysis. So, Nick, maybe you can talk a little bit about, how do you evaluate SOUP? How do you find vulnerabilities that may be in components that you've incorporated in, whether it's an operating system or drivers or whatever that is, how you do vulnerability scanning.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the very first steps is in order to investigate and determine what kind of vulnerabilities is to really build a catalog of what you got. Because without having an adequate understanding of the composition of your software components, you really won't be able to do a really in-depth analysis. So kind of very first steps is looking at your systems and determining all the different software that's ever under concern. That doesn't necessarily mean software that you've written. If you're using off-the-shelf parts, off-the-shelf hardware, and you're just configuring it, those are still points of concern. So we've been calling that the security bomb or a software bomb. So building that SBOM is a really important first step. How you do that is going to be a little bit different per system. Different types of systems, such as interpreted languages, have really nice package managers that will output you a complete manifest of all the packages you're using. Other systems are a little bit more difficult where they don't use package managers, and we have to use something called software composition analysis, where we do almost open source fingerprinting of binary images to find all the different types of SOUP that are in a system. You'd be surprised, often sometimes you'll have multiple of the same library embedded in different parts of your systems, all with different vulnerabilities. So it's really important to get an accurate understanding of what is in your system. Once you have that accurate list, one of the important thing of continuous monitoring is taking that list and looking to what are the reported vulnerabilities and anomalies with those different libraries. Those will greatly inform how those impact your system. You really will have to go through it, and the first time it might be kind of a big list of vulnerabilities to analyze, but you need to go through those one by one and understand the impact to your system of every vulnerability. After you've made that initial pass, it gets a little easier because you're only looking at changes as they accrue over time. But you need to do that first initial vulnerability scanning. Once you have that SBOM, my preference way is there are a lot of great tools out there, especially if you generate your SBOM into a format that is interoperable with other systems. One example is Cyclone DX. That's a really nice format that allows you to feed your SBOM into different systems that can do vulnerability analysis by going to different databases of reported anomalies and ingressing all those data to give you a list of different vulnerabilities, which you can then take and do a security analysis of how that impacts your system, which is probably the most important part, because while you might have a CVSS score or a common vulnerability score that is very high, that may not impact your system at all and have no relation. Or you might have one that's very low that does directly impact your software and its safety profile. So it's very important to go through and enumerate and look into each one of these vulnerabilities.
Go ahead.
Oh no, as on top of that, there's other types of testing options that you might want to employ to improve it during development, such as continuous vulnerability scanning of your software through static analysis, testing of your interfaces, and even potentially fuzz testing to try to catch boundary conditions. So
Okay, thank you. So Christine, I don't know if have you seen tools or techniques for storing the SBOM as part of the cybersecurity work that you've done?
Yeah, one consideration on storing SBOMs is, that is part of your configuration management. So if you've got a configuration management plan, that should be discussed as how you are controlling that. And the SBOM is really a blueprint to your software. So it's really important to store the SBOM in a high integrity, secure location with limited access, because you don't want this kind of information getting to the hands of your adversaries. And so I think that's an important consideration on storing SBOMs. Yeah, another aspect is making sure your SBOM is complete. It's obvious that libraries and packages should be listed, but Docker images, drivers, firmware loaded on chips. It's important to think about all the software that's comprising your system.
All right. Shiv, I don't know if you can talk a little bit about just when you find some of the vulnerabilities that Nick was talking about, like how do you evaluate them? How do you score them? How do you decide if it's something you need to address or something you can live with?
It's a great question. I think, so there's, as Nick mentioned, so there's the process of, I think, identifying these, these vulnerabilities and scoring them. And then the other aspect of this is to how do you assess based on the severity and the score, how does it impact your system? I mean, that is something that I think we've discussed it a few times in a few different ways. Is I think it comes down to, your system security risk. So if you have a very well-defined security risk plan and risk management, and what, if you've done that homework in your initial phase of your design, then this is just a mapping exercise. You just look at, the scores that you receive, because again, as Nick mentioned, these databases exist, these tools exist, these tools run through existing vulnerabilities and assess if your system is exposed to it or not and gives you a score. And, you are the best person for your application. You know exactly how it's going to impact your system. So if you have your risk document, you have these vulnerabilities, it's a comparison exercise. So I think it's no different than the way people assess safety. It's the same process. So at least that's I would say that's the simplest answer here. So it comes down to, again, doing your homework upfront and knowing your security vulnerabilities upfront, so that when something shows up that sounds bad, but it's like, hey, it doesn't impact my system. for one reason or the other. So we're not storing any patient data. So we're not worried about this encryption issue on the device, for example. So it's a function of, I think, the application.
Okay. So we've got about 15 minutes left, but before we kind of move on to Postmarket, I did have one more question for Nick, which was in terms of, you mentioned fuzz testing, so fuzz testing, penetration testing. So maybe you can define those a little bit and kind of say what the goals are, and is there a particular time where you think those are more important to do than others, or is there times where maybe you can do a lighter version of that testing?
Yeah, absolutely. There's since security is such a ever moving and evolving topic, more and more different testing strategies and testing tools are constantly coming out to help you evaluate the security risk of your product. So, like I mentioned, fuzz testing is a great testing tool for interfaces to just produce random entropy of data to see how your system responds. That doesn't necessarily mean it's an exploitable event, but you might catch instances where your software misbehaves. So the fuzz testing will take external interfaces and really just throw them through a bunch of variability and make sure that they're robust. That is something that can start very early. It has really no preconditions other than you have the interface present in order to fuzz test it. And it's one I'd recommend doing early. The other types of testing, security related, obviously, when you're making your risk analysis, you're going to have a bunch of mitigations that you're going to generate. Those are all going to be security level requirements, and they need to be tested and verified as well as any of the other requirements in your system. So testing those security ones to show that if you have a risk of denial of service, which might have additional risks to your product, such as delay of therapy or any other types of risks, that those are tested and shown to be implemented. Other types of testing I like to do on my products in order to get kind of ahead of the game is to do my own vulnerability scanning. So there's open source tools out there such as Nessus or Metasploit that allows you to point at interfaces, and those CVEs that I was mentioning, they also have a great database in these tools, along with Python scripts or any other types of scripts that actually will exploit them. So you can point these scanning tools at your product and look for the vulnerabilities yourself. Try to find them. You might be surprised at what you find. But finally, when you're getting to the later stages of your product, I always recommend going through a third party to do penetration testing. That can be an engagement in varying levels. You can go everywhere from what I call white box testing all the way to black box testing, and even with gray box testing in the middle. And what I mean by those box metaphors is that you provide the penetration testers with varying amounts of information for your system. The goal is to get back as much actionable information as you can. So going complete black box testing has some downsides of where it will take a lot longer, but they are equipped with the same knowledge as most people would externally. So you might get a more accurate representation, but it takes longer. Providing clear box or gray box testing allows you to give them requirements, design details, libraries, which allows them to be more actionable and be more targeted in their testing. That's usually something I save and will probably engage periodically through the post of the device. But those are kind of the varying, there's probably more in there that I missed, but those are kind of the high level ones.
All right, thank you. So one question came in while we were talking. I'll just kind of throw this out to whoever wants to jump in. But the question was, do you have to do threat modeling, fuzz testing, or other types of testing if you don't store patient data on your device?
So I would recommend if your device falls into the cyber device category of the medical devices, then yes, I think that those do apply. And I also think that fuzz testing, even for a non-medical device, is a great tool for testing robustness of interfaces to make sure there's a lot of unforeseen circumstances in the world and with analog systems that you can't always consider for. So I think they are good, robust strategies, regardless of the different types of devices. So I would implore to use them. They make a better product anyways, even outside the cybersecurity space.
All right, awesome. All right, well, we have a few minutes left, so I did want to one last topic that I thought would be beneficial to talk about today is post-market. So Shiv, maybe you can define, what do we mean when we say post-market? Obviously, you've gone through development, you've gone through your testing, now you just put it out there. What activities are you doing in the post-market to try and keep the device secure as it gets more and more acceptance in the field?
Yeah, so post-market is in this world of, as we discussed, evolving threat landscape, right? I think post-market is about looking at many different aspects of how you ensure that the safe use of your device and secure use of your device when it's in the wild. And that entails a whole bunch of things. It starts by, I think, our ability to continuously monitor the product and continuously be up to date with threat intelligence, and being able to know exactly if there's a new threat that has come up, to be able to have the ability to scan for those, understand those, and then react to those through updates and patches. So, which is essentially kind of the aspect of continuous monitoring and threat intelligence, which is about, I think, vulnerability modeling, monitoring, as well as making updates and patches to actually prevent against them or protect against them. Despite our best efforts, there's always a situation that can arise, and therefore post-market surveillance is also about how do you actually respond to incidents, and how do you respond and manage those incidents. So having a good incident response plan and having the ability to collaborate with your stakeholders and notify them about breaches, about security issues, is the importance of having an incident response plan and management. That's one other aspect of this. We talked about these databases on vulnerability. How did they come up? Well, because when different companies and different folks faced these kind of cybersecurity threats, they had to report, right? So there's a requirement around regulatory reporting and maintaining compliance. So when you actually face a cybersecurity issue, we have to have procedures in place to be able to report these things to the regulatory bodies. So that, again, that adds to the database, but also it's important for us to be aware of these things. And then, and I think I would say it also is about, I think, training and education around these things, that I think is also making people aware that, there is, we will have to do software updates, walking into a hospital every 3 months and asking them, hey, I need your system to update the software, is not something that anybody likes. But that's the reality of the situation. But can you do that remotely? If you want to do it remotely, then how do you want to do it? So capabilities like that and things like that is what I would kind of consider as post-market surveillance in a broad scheme. I mean, there's many things that have to be considered, but I would kind of summarize it in that way.
All right, thank you. So Christine, Shiv talked a lot about the patches. So I don't know, maybe you can just talk a little bit about the process of how you would go about, verifying a patch, right? So you identify a vulnerability, you have maybe an incident, and then you need to get a patch out there. So what sort of activities would you revisit as you're preparing that patch?
Well, certainly if you're changing the software, you've got to make sure that you're not introducing any additional safety risk associated with that. And of course, there's going to be a regression testing too. So that's where we have the systems approach, right? With security and safety. Actually, Nick, I remember the story you told about a good example of where that could be. Is you decide you want to add encryption to a communication interface, but in doing that, it uses more processing power. And if you're on a battery operated device, your life of the device is now reduced, and that could be a safety risk. So it's definitely important to think about what kind of safety risks, or maybe even other security risks that could be there. And so ideally, if automated testing is recommended, so that when you're doing your regression, it's not a huge lift. And looking at the vulnerabilities themselves, sometimes the vulnerability is not related to your use case. So if you have a library, the library does a bunch of things, but you're only using this small intended use that's not affected by the vulnerability. In that case, to do that analysis, to not unnecessarily have to do a patch, right? Because there's always a risk. So those are some considerations. And so touching on what Shiv said, it's very important to have a plan about how you're going to do the patch, and talking about how often you should be doing these monitoring. Ideally, it's event driven. So because really important point is your security effectiveness is really correlated with how fast you can fix it. So the longer the vulnerability is out there, the more likely there could be an exploit. So being responsive is really important.
All right, thank you. Well, we're starting to get a little bit tight on time, so I'll just kind of open it up and see if anyone has any last thoughts they want to say. Otherwise, Nicole, there was a question about can we provide a list of standards that we mentioned in here? So if we can maybe email that out afterward, that would be good. But does anyone have any final thoughts before we wrap up? And if not, we'll probably end up wrapping up. I think we've gone through a lot. There's a lot of areas we didn't touch on today either. There's a whole series of post-market things and submissions to the FDA, which we didn't really get into, but hopefully you guys found this informational, and if you do have questions, you can always try and reach back out to Sunrise and we can help you with that. But I think I'll turn it back over to Nicole, and we'll wrap up so we can finish up by 1.
All right. Thank you so much. What an awesome conversation. Dave, is there a good email for folks to reach out to Sunrise if they have any questions?
Barb, do you have a generic email or an email that would be best?
Or do you have a slide you want to flip to? Maybe
Oh.
that has the contact information.
Yeah, there's a
Regardless.
slide. Yep.
Awesome.
There we go.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you to our panel. Really appreciate your expertise. Just want to say thank you to Sunrise Labs for sponsoring today's content. We can't put on these expert panels without support of members like you, so really appreciate that. Please make sure to check out massmedic.com and go to our events tab and see all of the great events we have coming up. And we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.